The term sacred sexuality, many persons view the juxtaposition of these two words as strange, foreign, awkward, perhaps even antagonistic.
Please welcome Dr. Robert Hemfelt.
Now that you have all been lulled into a hypnagogic state, we will launch into sacred sexuality, which may animate and revivify the audience. Over the next hour, I hope to suggest to you that there are powerful, positive, intertwining synergies among spiritual love, erotic love, and romantic love. Most of what I share today is going to be streaming video from documentaries and from cinematic artistic creations. Concerning sex, I thought as perhaps controversial and sometimes bewildering as this topic can be, I would begin on kind of a light, humorous note. I'm going to show you an excerpt from Mystic Pizza. It doesn't center on the character played by Julia Roberts. It centers on a character by the name of Josephine, or Jo. She is engaged to a New England fisherman, Bill, who very, very much wants to marry her. She has twice been engaged to him and twice canceled. As the movie opens, this is now her third march down the aisle to join into holy matrimony with Bill.
Declare your intentions to enter a binding and permanent union with one another for as long as you both shall draw breath on this earth.
Jesus Christ. Following that, in Mystic Pizza is also a quick scene of Bill and Josephine contemplating having sex. The only problem, they're in her parents' house, and her parents have an illuminated plexiglass bust of Jesus. And they are attempting to be erotic under the vision of Jesus.
I can't do this with him staring at me.
All right, let's just go to my room.
What, are you crazy? Your parents are...
No, they're asleep.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm going home.
What? Bill. No, please, Bill, please don't.
Joe, I gotta go.
Just one more kiss.
We see between Bill and Josephina two things. One, this supposed unwarranted conflict between the spiritual and the elemental, the material. We also see a gender reversal. Normally, which gender is supposed to be commitment phobic? The male is our cultural gender stereotype. We live here in the 21st century in America, in Western civilization, still under the very long history of 3,500 years of very heavy patriarchal orientation of our society without adequate recognition of the co-equal feminine dimension in everything from politics to art. A brief excerpt from a French movie. It's a movie made about the famous love affair between two Parisian artists 100 years ago, Rodin the sculptor, and his lover and student, Camille Claudel. At that time, women were not recognized as being worthy to craft at the level of Rodin. 100 years later, with the works that she did not later destroy, it was estimated that she may have far, far surpassed her master. In this scene, Auguste Rodin comes to Camille's studio. He wants to feel her statues before he will even open his eyes and see what her latest work has been. He is pleased with what he finds until his hands run across a sculpture of a man being pulled in two directions by two women. And suddenly, with great indignation, he says, "How dare you sculpt the reality of our relationship?" Well, we would like to think of Rodin as a pioneering sculptor of the 19th and 20th century when he says to Camille, "You will do exactly what I tell you to do, and you will submit all of your ideas to me." Do we hear a slight ring of male dominance and patriarchy? The reason I think this is important with regard to sex, especially as it has distilled down now into the 20th and 21st centuries, on the side of the prohibition of sex, you might have Jerry Falwell, or Spiro T. Agnew, or Billy Graham. And of course, running in tandem with that, we have the other extremity, and that is the profanation of sex, where sex is perhaps being exploited, overexposed, unnecessarily commercialized. So prohibition of sexuality in one line, profanation of sexuality in the other, and unfortunately, the twain rarely meet. That meeting, that juncture point, that coming together, that synthesis will be a major point of this talk. To give you a quick in vivo feel for how radical these two positions are, I'm going to share a little bit of vintage video with you. The first is an interview between Hugh Hefner, representing the Playboy philosophy, being interviewed by no less than William F. Buckley Jr. Understandably, Hefner and Buckley have somewhat differing opinions about the Playboy philosophy. And right on the tail of that clip, we'll see about 60 minutes of a name lost in history, Spiro Agnew. He is reacting in the year 1969 to the debut of two plays on Broadway, Hair and O Calcutta.
Christian code or the religious code. Why do you take the position that the Playboy philosophy is really, in a sense, non-controversial? That it is sort of congruent with the new reality, if in fact you have rewritten the ancient theological tablets? Oughtn't you to claim some kind of a moral authority to do so? And if so, what is that moral authority? Is it only your own intuition, or what is it?
Well, first of all, I don't think that just related to sex, just that part of the philosophy, this is not really a rejection in any real sense of the total Christian ethic related to sex. It's an attempt to reevaluate some of the social sexual ills of our time, and I think that what's going on in society at this particular time, this quest for a new morality, is something that we're only, one small voice in, and it's really an attempt to supply a 20th century code. Although I dislike the word code, because I think the old legalism is part of the problem. I think that hopefully we're going to evolve a more what's been called situation ethics, an approach to ethical problems where sex is concerned, not unlike the approach that we use where other problems are concerned. In no other area of morality, I don't think, is is it as cut and dried that you follow a certain law simply to follow that law, even if it sometimes takes you out the window. In the case of premarital sex, I think you've got the prime example of this.
How so?
Well, we've taken the attitude traditionally, and this certainly didn't begin, it's not Christian in the sense that it came from Christ per se, but it's something that grew through the organization and historical, the anti-sexual aspect of the Christian ethic grew through the centuries and became especially extreme in the Puritan and Victorian thing that we suffer from here in America. And it's a rejection of the notion that sex can have any real place, any moral place prior to marriage. And I don't think this is really, I don't think it's logical. I think we know a great deal more about the psychosexual nature of man now that indicates that it's not logical. I don't think it's truly to the best interest of people, and I don't think it's truly moral.
A Broadway musical that simulates a sex act is hailed by critics and is doing a land office business at the box office. As long as Richard Nixon is president, Main Street is not going to turn into Smut Alley.
Well, you have all been cautioned not to turn Main Street into Smut Alley. If we underestimate some of the anti-sexuality strains, even in America in the 50s and 60s, Playboy was first published in 1953. In 1957, a student of Sigmund Freud, Wilhelm Reich, who had studied with Freud in the 1930s in Vienna, fled the Nazis to America, continued his research here in the bastion of democracy, and whether you think his theories sound or fallacious, Reich had begun to posit the notion that there is some universal energy force that permeates all living objects. And today that might be something equivalent to what's talked about in cosmic physics as string theory. Unfortunately, Reich named it orgone, and he said that sexual sharing, sexual orgasm, was a very intense conjuncture of this orgone energy coming together. Well, the Food and Drug Administration took umbrage with this. Reich had built some plywood boxes, and they were nothing more than that, plywood boxes with alternating layers of insulation and sheet metal. And he claimed if one sat in the plywood box, it was an accumulator of the orgone energy. The Food and Drug Administration took him to court, won an injunction that he could not transport these boxes across state lines. His books could not be transported across state lines. Unknown to Reich, one of his subordinates drove a carload of his books into New York State. At that moment, Wilhelm Reich was held in contempt of court. He was imprisoned. He died in prison. This is 1957 in America. And the New York Sanitation Department was ordered to incinerate the existing books of Reich that had been imported into the state. And so we have the imprisoning of a man, the burning, literally the incineration of his books, largely because of this association that maybe orgone energy has something to do with orgasm and things that we just can't endorse in the 1950s. Well, to go back in history, I've mentioned before that we are living under this heavy mantle of 3,500 years of Judeo-Christian patriarchal orientation. Prior to that, it is speculated that in prehistory, most civilizations, most gatherings of persons in Sumer and the Mesopotamian region, and also in an area that is now called Old Europe, and that was comprised of what we today refer to as Italy, Greece, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, that in these pre-Judeo-Christian societies, the deities, those worshipped, were always one of two things. Either the worship of the goddess, that God is feminine, and some of you may be familiar with the land-breaking book by Merlin Stone, simply entitled, When God Was a Woman. In the other societies that were not heavily goddess-oriented, there was always the pair of God and goddess, Isis and Osiris in Egypt. Even in the land of Canaan, into which the Hebrews migrated, the high god, the sky god, was El, but his two derivatives were Baal and Anat. And their intercourse, their sexual sharing, was said to infuse the land with fertility, that as the gods make love and share sexually, so does the rain permeate the earth, and there is regeneration and fertility. What I want to share with you next, out of a documentary called Sex in the Bible, is a brief summary. If we can go back before 3,500 years ago and get a glimpse at a very different orientation of the feminine, the mater, the earth, the elemental, and the sexual.
The surprising and moving stories of physical passion that are found within the pages of the Holy Bible shape our attitudes about sex, even though we may not be aware of their influence. What does Scripture tell us about human intimacy? Did its lessons about sexuality change in the course of some 20 centuries of biblical history? 4,000 years ago, in the hardscrabble agricultural world of the ancient Near East, fertility was everything, and it was believed only the gods could grant it. It was a time before the Bible. A minor clan called the Hebrews was surrounded by many pagan tribes: Canaanites, Ammonites, Philistines. These prayed to a god called Baal for rich harvests, fertile flocks, and many children to work the soil. Their worship of this pagan deity may have included communal sex rites.
Neighbors surrounding Israel may have practiced what scholars call the sacred marriage rite. This may have been a public ritual where the king played the part of the weather god and had sex with the fertility goddess, whose part was played by the high priestess or the queen.
They would have sexual relations within the cult. And what you had behind this was sympathetic magic, that an action on a small scale would produce the like effects on a large scale. So by the sexual intercourse within the cult, it was thought that this would produce fertility in the land, in animals, in human beings, and it was all geared to natural religion.
The worship of Baal, if any of you are scholars of the Old Testament, you will remember there are numerous pejorative references to Baal. We know that the ancient Hebrew scriptures were edited and re-edited and revised over time, but we see the competition among the Hebrews between, do we worship Baal and Anat, these so-called pagan god and goddess, or do we worship this new masculine deity, Yahweh, Jehovah? And it was not uncommon in some of these pre-Judeo societies that there would be communal sex among the tribe and or symbolic celebrating sex between the king and queen, believing that, again, human fertility and the fertility of life and the earth giving up its bounty in agriculture, were somehow inextricably interrelated. With the editing and re-editing of the Old Testament scriptures, Baal came to have more and more negative judgments placed upon him and Anat. And there's one very compassionate piece of scripture where the priest of Yahweh challenged the priest of Baal to see who can draw down fire from heaven. Well, the priests of Baal are not successful in the account given to us. The priests of Yahweh do bring down fire from heaven, and in an act of charity, they then slay all 300 of the priests of Baal. So there's some ruddy stuff in the Old Testament. Also in the Old Testament, you will hear references, somewhat obscure, to periods of reform when temple prostitutes were cast out of the Jewish temple. The fact that they are periodically cast out means, of course, that there were periods of time where the temple prostitutes were in the Jewish temple and where persons would come to have sacred sexual relations. One last piece that I'd like to share with you before we go on to some more material. A group of women, foremost among them the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas and the archaeologist that I mentioned previously, Merlin Stone, who wrote the book When God Was a Woman. In their excavations of old Europe, which is the southern central part of what today we know as Europe, they uncovered hundreds, thousands of carved figurines, almost exclusively of the feminine form. And oftentimes they would show in pronounced caricature the reproductive organs, the robust breast, wide hips, the conspicuous pubic triangle. And these archaeologists began to speculate that the abundance of these figurines and the absence of male figurines indicates that these prehistory gatherings were very much oriented around women and around worship of the goddess. What I'll share with you next is a few minutes from a documentary made in the 1990s by the Canadian Film Board. It's a marvelous piece of work. It is simply called The Goddess Remembered.
The spiritual journey of Earth's peoples began with the idea of a goddess, universally called the Great Mother. We know that thousands of years before the Bible was ever written, creation stories centered around a goddess. The reverence our ancestors once felt for the primal power of the female is reflected in those dimly lit times of the prehistoric ages, when the power to give and nurture was supreme.
We have in that brief piece of video the stark contrast of the pre-Judeo-Christian goddess reverence and today what are our masculine cities, buildings, and social hierarchy. It is believed that in these goddess-oriented societies, they were very egalitarian and very peaceful. There is no record of weapons or warfare until they were eventually conquered by the weapon-bearing tribes of the Indo-Europeans. Through the lines of Judaism and especially Christianity, which has been the powerful shaping force of Western civilization for the past 2,000 years, we've had some very negative attitudes toward women. One theologian has said we may or may not have had Christianity with or without the carpenter from Nazareth. We certainly would not have had it without Paul. And Paul was an early writer of what today comprised large portions of the New Testament. And Paul was not enthusiastic about sex. He was single and celibate. He advised others to do likewise. He was not even enthusiastic about marriage. There's the famous scripture in which he says, well, maybe it's better to marry than to burn with lust. But beyond that, there was no positive endorsement of sex. A 3rd century Christian theologian who was quite an influential, Origen, castrated himself. He later thought better of the gesture, but it was difficult to reverse. And then when we come to the 5th century, probably the second most important theologian, second only to Paul, is Augustine. And Augustine had lived a very lusty life as a young man, lived with his mistress, sired a child, but then had a Christian conversion. Now, prior to his Christianity, he had been a Manichaean, which is derivative of Zoroastrianism. And in that belief system, there is an absolute disjuncture between spirit and matter. That which is matter, including body and sex, is corrupt. That which is apart from body is sacred and holy. And so Augustine referred to the city of God, which doesn't dwell with the city of man. In Augustine's writings, if you still distill down his edicts about sexuality, he said, it is only permissible in marriage, only for the purpose of procreation, only with the man in the male superior position, and only if both parties don't enjoy the experience. That seems like a bit of a daunting task. In one of Woody Allen's movies, Manhattan, Woody Allen is attending a black tie cocktail reception, and a woman next to him is talking about her psychoanalysis. And she announces to the discussion group at the cocktail party,
I finally had an orgasm and my doctor told me it was the wrong kind.
You got the wrong kind? Really? I've never had the wrong kind, ever. My worst one was right on the money.
What I want to share next with you, and we're going to go down to a much more recent piece of art. It was the last masterpiece of the famous director, Stanley Kubrick. Now, he gave us A Space Odyssey 2001, in which he probed the limits of spatial and temporal infinity. How far out into infinity and space can we image or imagine? For his last dying work, and he did die before this was actually shown in theaters, he chose to go deep down into the interior of the human psyche and probe what the dynamic of sexuality is there. We have erotic love, which can be somewhat impersonal. I can walk down the street, see an attractive woman, feel attraction to her with no other connection. At the other end of the polarity is agape love, which is kind of a generic spiritual love. I love humanity, love anyone and everyone, love the human race. And my contention is that between these two, we find something called romantic love, which can become highly personal and deeply centered onto one partner. So what I'm going to conclude with this morning is an excerpt from Stanley Kubrick's final masterpiece, Eyes Wide Shut. In this movie, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman play an affluent, young New York couple. He is a physician. She runs an art gallery. The night before, they had been to a party, and both had persons flirting with them at this Christmas cocktail party. This is the night after. They get high on marijuana and suddenly begin to talk about these polarities. Do I love you and you alone? Or is there a part of me that can be pulled in an impersonal way to anyone and everyone? And you will hear in a beautiful, long monologue from Nicole Kidman her final resolution of this. She talks about having been attracted to a man a year ago when they were on a summer vacation. And she says, I would have given up everything, you, my marriage, our child, to be with him one night. She didn't do it. And now she says, my awareness of that, my reflection on that makes you, my husband, my declared romantic partner, more dear to me than ever before.
Tell me something. Those two girls at the party last night? Did you, by any chance, happen to fuck them?
What? What are you talking about?
I'm talking about the two girls that you were so blatantly hitting on.
I wasn't hitting on anybody.
Who were they? where did you disappear to with them for so long?
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I didn't disappear with anybody. Secret wasn't feeling too well. I got called upstairs to see him. Anyway, who's the guy you were dancing with?
A friend of the Zigglers.
What did he want?
What did he want? What did he want? Sex. Upstairs. Then and there.
Is that all?
Yeah. Yeah, that was all.
Just wanted to fuck my wife.
That's right.
I guess that's understandable.
Understandable.
Because you were a very beautiful woman.
Whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Wait. So, because I'm a beautiful woman, the only reason any man ever wants to talk to me is because he wants to fuck me? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't think it's quite that black and white, but I think we both know what men are like.
So on that basis, I should conclude that you wanted to fuck those two models.
There are exceptions.
And what makes you an exception?
What makes me an exception is that I happen to be in love with you. And because we're married, and because I would never lie to you or hurt you.
Do you realize that what you're saying is that the only reason you wouldn't fuck those two models is out of consideration for me, not because you really wouldn't want to?
It's just relax. This pot is making you aggressive.
No, it's not the pot, it's you. Why can't you ever give me a straight fucking answer?
I was under the impression that's what I was doing. I don't even know what we're arguing about here.
I'm not arguing. I'm just trying to find out where you're coming from.
Where I'm coming from.
Let's say, for example, you have some gorgeous woman standing in your office, naked, and you're feeling her fucking tits. Now, what I want to know, what are you really thinking about when you're squeezing them?
Alice, I happen to be a doctor. It's all very impersonal, and you know there's always a nurse present.
So when you're feeling tits, it's nothing more than just your professionalism. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Sex is the last thing on my mind when I'm with a patient.
Now, when she is having her little titties squeezed, do you think she ever has any little fantasies about what handsome Dr. Bill's Dickie might be like?
I can assure you, sex is the last thing on this fucking hypothetical woman patient's mind.
And what makes you so sure?
If for no better reason, because she's afraid of what I might find.
Okay. Okay, so after you tell her that everything's fine, what then?
What then? I don't know, Alice. What then? Look. Women don't. They basically just don't think like that.
Millions of years of evolution. Right? Right? Men have to stick it in every place they can, but for women, it is just about security and commitment and whatever the fuck else.
A little oversimplified, Alice, but yes, something like that.
If you men only knew.
I'll tell you what I do know is you got a little stoned tonight and you've been trying to pick a fight with me and now you're trying to make me jealous.
But you're not the jealous type, are you?
No, I'm not.
You've never been jealous about me, have you?
No, I haven't.
And why haven't you ever been jealous about me?
Well, I don't know, Alice. Maybe because you're my wife. Maybe because you're the mother of my child. And I know you would never be unfaithful to me.
You are very sure of yourself, aren't you?
No. I'm sure of you. Do you think that's funny? Now we get the fucking laughing fit, right?
Do you remember last summer at Cape Cod?
Yes.
Do you remember one night in the dining room, there was this young naval officer, and he was sitting near our table with two other officers.
No.
The waiter brought him a message, which point he left. Nothing rings a bell?
No.
Well, I first saw him that morning in the lobby. He was checking into the hotel, and he was following the bellboy with his luggage to the elevator. He glanced at me as he walked past, just a glance. Nothing more. But I could hardly move. That afternoon, Helena went to the movies with her friend, and you and I made love. And we made plans about our future. And we talked about Helena. And yet, at no time was he ever out of my mind. And I thought if he wanted me, even if it was only for one night, I was ready to give up everything.